Welcome back to our lecture series, Lessons in History. Today we're going to be talking about Victorian hair. So we're just going to jump in. It's going to be an interesting day. It won't be quite as long as some of our other ones, but should be entertaining. So, Victorian hair. There are so many different things to discuss Victorian hair. Just looking into this topic, like, where do you begin? Where do you begin? So I kind of just thought, how do you begin your day? You begin by taking care of your hair, maybe taking a shower. So researching that some was interesting. In the early 1800s, it was very normal to take a bath maybe once a month because hygiene is important. So once a month. By the 1840s, they decided that brushing was actually not enough to care for your hair. At that point, before then, ladies would often put like a towel or a cloth over their shoulders, and then they'd brush their hair out, and so it would keep any dirt or debris, anything that was in their hair, from getting on their clothing. So they brushed their hair out, but that was it. They just brushed their hair. They weren't adding water, they weren't adding any kind of astringent or cleaning agent, anything like that, just simply brushing. In the 1840s, they decided that brushing was simply not enough, and that some water was safe to apply to your head. You weren't going to get sick from it. And so then it was encouraged that maybe every other week you could wash your hair. And so they'd actually boil water, and they'd put in things like rosemary and let it boil there. Take that out, and then you would wash your hair with that rosemary infused water, and that would actually make it kind of a little bit astringent, which would actually be cleansing to the scalp. So they would do that. Eventually, by the late 1800s, they were using soap, again, maybe once a week, and that would be quite a bit. More often than not, probably still every other week, washing your hair. But they would use soap, but the soap at the time you had to be really careful with. It was much harsher than soaps we have today. So you'd often have a sore scalp afterwards. You could even have redness, you could have issues with your hair getting too dry, too brittle, just because it was such a harsh soap they had at the time. It wasn't until the early 1900s, like 1908 or 1910, I forget exactly which, but somewhere in there they started writing articles about how washing your hair once a week was really probably what you needed to do, just to keep it nice and clean and shiny. They had better soaps by then. But actually, daily washing of our hair didn't really come about till the 1970s and 1980s, when you start seeing commercials come up with new shampoos that are gentler on your hair that you could use daily. And you start having all these ads of people running along beaches or taking their hair and throwing it in the wind. And you had all these beautiful moments of beautiful hair. And people are like, oh, so if I wash my hair every day, I'm going to look like that. Great marketing. But yeah, you really don't see it before then. So doing this, actually having hair washed daily, is a very new concept for us. Only in the last 50 years or so has that become a regular thing. So thinking about all of that, all of these tools here were used in regular life with Victorian hair. So it was a much thicker kind of hair, just because you weren't washing all of the oils out of your hair, so it had more grip to it. But also your hair was going to be dictated a lot by fashion, and fashion changed quite a bit. In the early 1800s up to like the 1860s, I want to say, bonnets were incredibly popular. They were often very trendy. You would see some variation in hairstyles, but often the bonnet held strong for a long time in fashion. And what that meant is that you were taking your bonnet on and off your head. And if you gentlemen have ever wore hats, you know that you have hat hair. Women also combated that by the way they would style their hair. So you do a center part, and then you do a part actually around the center of your head. And that whole front portion would be what you would style. While the back you pull back into a bun, and that's what your bonnet would cover. So that front portion of hair, you might have flats, you might have curls in it. It would depend on what the fashion style was at the time. You might even have them twisted down in elaborate braids so it would loop around the ear, or sometimes it was improper for you to show your ears. That was a fashion faux pas, So you cover your ears, and people apparently didn't have ears for a while there. And then they become popular to show your ears again. So fashion was quite entertaining to look at for all of that period. Now by the 1860s, 70s, it becomes more popular to have your hair up in a bun, but like a loose bun that would have a lot of volume to it. And so then they had little tiny hats that would perch on the top. So hats were always really important, especially if you're outside of the home. Inside of the home, you could wear a bonnet, but oftentimes it was more when you were leaving the home that you'd always have to have a bonnet or a hat on your head. It was just proper etiquette. Now, some of the things we have here are things like this hat pin here, or you could use it for a bonnet or a hat. When you have those on your head and you're going outside, if it's at all windy or blustery kind of weather, or if you just aren't sure what you're going to be doing, maybe you'll be riding on a horseback, or you'll be riding in an open carriage, you want to make sure your bonnet and your hat is going to stay in place. So you'd use this kind of tool here that would go through your hat, through your hair, and it would help secure the hat to your head. So we have this lovely one here that's really, really beautiful jewel. I'm not really sure, it's probably paste, it's probably not real, but it's really a lovely specimen there. This one here is a little bit more, I don't know, they're both pretty big and in your face. They're very, very much fashion statement pieces. And that's part of the thing too, is how would you differentiate yourself from someone else? So you'd have unique things like this that you'd put in your hat, or you put in your hair, different hairpins like this that could be in a hat or simply in your hairdo. We have several. This circular one here, there's this purple one here that's just fun. Has a nice twist to it. So when you'd be moving, it would reflect the light. You also have a couple other here, two matching ones you could have done in your hair, different ways that have the jewels on them, again, catching light, reflecting that back. This here is actually a hat pin cushion. So you could put your hat pins and your hair pins in here. And it's just a giant pin cushion. It's really elaborate, beaded. It would have been originally purple velvet. A lot of that has kind of faded with time. Just a lovely piece. Now, when you're doing your ringlets and everything like that, you might use a curling iron like this. I always am amazed that they didn't burn off their hair more. If you ever read Little Women, there's a scene where I forget if they're curling or crimping the hair, and a section of the hair comes off because it was on too long with the crimping iron and the curling iron. I imagine that wasn't a singular story. Also with the big hairdos, keeping everything in place, you'd use different combs like this, like a French fork, or the different combs, and that kind of add more glamour to it, but also help secure it. Actually, what's interesting when I was reading, the big poofy designs, those were often a sign that you were of wealth, that you could not, that you didn't have to, what's the word I'm looking for? You didn't have to work, you didn't have to move around and do a lot, because when you'd move around a lot, actually, your hair would actually fall out of those designs. So it's a sign that you didn't have to do much. You could sit around, be casual, you didn't have to work, you didn't have to go off and lean over to scrub, clean, do things like that. So it's a sign of wealth. Because sometimes the hairdos were very easy, very accessible to a lower class. So having a hair like that, where it's big and poofy and loose, was something that was just for your aristocracy, just for your upper class. So it was a good differentiation, which was important to them at that point. Now thinking more about hair care, this brush here is actually one that has an L engraved on the back. This is actually Joanna Lane's hairbrush. Joanna Lane is a woman that lived in the home here where we are, historic Lane Place. So this is kind of neat. This was her hairbrush. So she would brush her hair with this, probably morning and night. And one of the things that women would actually do is once they brush their hair, they pull their hair out of this and they put it into this little jar here called a hair receptacle. It's two pieces. It's actually a bowl and then a lid with a hole, and that's where you'd stuff the hair down, and then they take the hair out and they could use it for different things. For some of these elaborate hairstyles, they'd actually make things called racks, and they would have like hair that they kind of stick together once they had enough, and they put it underneath their hair to give it the poofiness that you see in so many of the big Victorian hairstyles. But they could also do a lot of crafts with them. There's actually 4 different styles of crafts they would do. They could do hair palette work, which that would be where where you would take hair and you would put it flat on a piece of like tissue paper, and you would actually glue it on strand next to strand, and then you could cut it into elaborate shapes and put it into designs. So you could use it for hair jewelry, in rings or in brooches or lockets. You can also do it in like different kinds of art pieces. So it would be for two-dimensional art. There's also hair, I can't remember what it's called. It's like a hair braiding technique, which you'd use like a braiding table. So it'd be a circular table with a hole in the middle, and you'd have your hair put in with weights hanging down so you could make elaborate braids out of them. And those braids then could be used for necklace chains or chains for like a pocket watch, but they were very sturdily made. There's also hair wire work, which is often what we see in like hair wreaths, different kinds of designs like that, where you make elaborate floral designs, which we'll talk about later. Owen will talk about that. And then a final thing would be hair sepia work. And sepia is just like how we think of sepia tone. What they would actually do is they take hair, cut it into really fine little pieces, and mix it in with, I forget what kind of a liquid, but they basically put it together and they make like a paint out of the hair. So it'd be the tone of the hair would create the color of the paint, and then they paint little designs and be made out of that person's hair. So different ways to do that. So there's lots of different ways that Victorians would use hair. And why would they do that? Mostly there's a really strong sense of sentimentality, which would translate over into mourning culture, but the sentimentality was just different ways for them to connect with their loved ones and really to have different mementos from the family members, the different people they came across, friends, everything like that, which is just really interesting. So something thinking about that, where did they come up with all of this hair? For the hairdos that they did that were really elaborate, or when they had to have hair racks that they didn't have enough hair to create as big a hair rack as they needed for whatever design, or for the hair wreaths, or for the hair lockets and everything like that. A lot of times the hair for the hairdos and things like that, even wigs or locks of hair they could clip in, actually came from the lower classes. So people who were poor, who were destitute, they would sell locks of hair. You see that again, Little Women is on my mind. One of the girls in there sells a lock of her, sells her hair for like $25, which would be like $500, probably more than that even today. And it's just a way that they could make money. Hair was going to grow back, so it wasn't a concern. Also, something interesting is that this was when you start to see the rise in popularity for open casket funerals, because some morticians would actually clip the dead people's hair to sell prior to the funeral, and so it was popular to have open caskets because then the person couldn't sell the hair, and they saw the person buried with all of their hair attached to their head. So it's kind of an interesting thing that would change. I know, right? Kind of icky. This is also in the late 1800s, you start seeing advertisements in places like Sears catalogs, where they would actually have like, you can go and you can send to this person to create hair designs for you, and you can choose from these different designs. And Sears eventually had to put a disclaimer in there saying, this is not something we do, this is a third party kind of thing. We send this out to someone else. We cannot assure you that this is your hair from your loved one coming back to you. It might be someone else's. Because if it was a really fine hair or a really nice specimen, they might keep it to use for something else, and they give a lower quality hair back in the design. So it's just kind of wild. Or maybe they weren't even using human hair. They could have been using animal hair for all I know. So just really fascinating stuff when you start to kind of spiral into hair art and art crafts. Really fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the crafts and stuff that we have here in our collection?
Yeah, so looking at the table here, we have actually in on the ground. We do have a couple of different things. I guess I'll start off with the smaller pieces first. And really, these pieces here kind of delve into something that Jill mentioned earlier, mourning culture. And kind of what that was, you see around the 16th, 17th century, really kind of took off more than 18th century as well. You'll see where over in England, people were actually collecting hair and doing hair art to remember the dead as a way of keeping a piece of that person with them as because it's kind of the idea like the body may go, but if I keep a piece of their hair or a piece of them with me, then maybe it's not like the person is completely perishing. Maybe I will have an opportunity to see them again in the future because they're here. It's almost like the idea if I keep a piece of their hair, then it's like almost like their soul is still almost here with me, or the spirit is here alive with me. And that kind of grows on into the 19th century as well, with more spiritualism and evangelical practices that were happening at the time as well. But typically there were three different forms of, or three different, I guess you can say, call them hair relics, three different forms of hair relics. There was holy hair relics, celebrity artifacts, or mementos to an ordinary person. So we have an interesting display here. Actually, we hit two of those categories. We're missing the holy relic. But I'll actually dive back and talk about the holy relic real quick. Some folks would actually, at the time, collect the hair of holy figures, put them in lockets, or maybe have them braided in a specific fashion, carry that person's hair with them, and it was the belief if you carried the hair of a holy figure with you, it would actually cure you of ailments or kind of keep you safe. So that was done with like Siddhartha Gautama or Buddha, Muhammad, as well as another figure that you would typically see like remnants of hair cut from in this belief. Celebrity hair is another one I mentioned that kind of really kicked off in the 16th century with like kings and queens. People would literally take the hair of kings and queens and keep it with them as like a celebrity kind of artifact piece. And funny enough, we have a 19th century celebrity artifact piece here at the Lane Place, which is in this locket right here. I always love to point to this. This locks of Abraham Lincoln's hair that were gathered by Dr. Charles Taft, the guy who did the autopsy on, or doctor who did the autopsy on President Lincoln after he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. So it's an interesting piece there. But then let's move to something that's a little bit, I'll say kind of a little bit more interesting. It's like celebrities and holy figures. It kind of makes sense. The idea that like, these people are always going to be important. Their names are always going to be around. So, the hair might be significant. But let's talk about the ordinary person. So moving into more of the 19th century Victorian era, really death was within the home. Today, death is obviously outside the home due to medical and institutionalized, I guess you say like death, if you will, or caretaking, institutionalized care. So really today we don't really see death like in our homes like that, like the Victorians did. So with that being said, we do have lockets, even different types of hair art like this as well. There are really mementos to ordinary people. And granted, we could say that both this one and this locket or this hairpiece and this locket right here are pretty significant, at least locally, because they're pretty big figures here in town. But in retrospect, it was kind of the hair of the ordinary person. Really the thing here is it was the belief that if you were to keep some of your family members' hair, put it into a locket, it would essentially, you would have a piece of them with you forever. It was kind of this idea that like, though they may not be here physically, I might be able to go and see them again. So here, like we have the locks of Major Isaac Compton Elliston, pictured on the wall over here. He's the father of Joanna Elliston, Henry S. Lane's wife. So this is actually a piece that Mrs. Elliston gathered, and it's called a widow's lock of hair. So she kept a piece of his hair in remembrance of him. We have this piece here. Obviously looks a lot different, a lot bigger, more elaborate piece. This piece is actually a living memorial of the Elliston family. You can see there's all the different colors throughout here. This is a very ornate floral design, but it's all made of human head hair. This is another example of a hair relic at the time. And we have another one down here. It's in a wreath, and really with the different formats, if you see a floral design, it could be more of a living memorial for somebody. Something that's more of a wreath design might be more of a post-mortem remembrance. This kind of takes place in those two different forms for distinction. Yeah, so the Victorians did so many more things as well, not just pieces like this or just keeping hair in lockets. They would actually, I'll use my watch band actually as an example for this. They would actually make bracelets of hair where they would literally braid, like, kind of like, think of like a watch band or a bracelet band. It's all full of human head hair, and then usually you have a locket attached at the front, typically with maybe that individual's initials on it. They would also make necklaces out of human head hair. They would just go around the neck. Same thing in that braid. Again, maybe have an initial or a locket. They might have some more hair or some, or, some kind of other design on there. And then also, Victorians also made some interesting art pieces as well, like canvas paintings. They would may have a funerary scene, like one in particular that caught my eye was a lady mourning her spouse that had passed away, and there's a weeping willow tree in the background, which is also a Victorian symbol of death. But it's either, for one, like Jill mentioned, using hair as to get the color from the hair, the sepia.
And then the palette, that's what they were saying too, is that sometimes they would do the hair and then cut it into like the shape for the weeping willow, especially for small designs.
Yeah, and so you would typically see like that design in the background too, the weeping willow hanging over there is literally made of hair. So that's kind of an interesting thing as well. So it takes form in many different, forms of art. But let's, even thinking about it, who would be making a piece like this? I think, it's interesting for one just to look at these pieces and say, oh wow, these are pretty interesting. But this was typically seen as ladies' work. I mean, this was seen as a way for a lady to make money out of her home. In the Crawfordsville Journal, I actually came across a kind of a catalog, if you will. It was literally titled Ladies' Work, and it showed what different ladies around Crawfordsville, or a group of ladies, were making, and one of them was actually hair wreaths. And at the time, what it would have sold for, which is kind of crazy to me, it sold for $1. But it appeared on the catalog itself. So apparently you can get a hair wreath in Crawfordsville in like the 1870s for $1. But it was, like I said, typically seen as women's work. And think about folks who were wearing items like this, or the ornate items of mourning. It was typically seen as a middle to high class thing. If you were wearing hair art like this, or hair relics like this, you were typically seen as a wealthier person. You want to show off your status at this time as well. So it's kind of another just interesting tidbit about this kind of stuff.
So something that was interesting that you mentioned there about whose work it was definitely considered more ladies' work. Something I did read about what we thought was interesting was it started out as a home craft, as something that people would do in the home, and as it became more popular, then you start seeing more professional people start to do this, and it became a really high class, very expensive thing to do with people who were really, really good craftsmen. But then it became more popularized, and that's where you start seeing it in the Sears catalogs, and it becomes more widespread and more accessible. And then trust in it went down because of people sending it off to people they never saw in real person, like in real life. Like it was never a one-to-one face meeting with these people. You were sending off your loved one's locks of hair and then receiving a product that you hoped was still with their locks of hair. And so then it had a flip where it turned back into more of a home craft again, because people didn't trust people to actually make it for them with their own hair. So it's interesting how there was kind of an arc to it with who was creating this.
That's interesting.
Because some of the pictures I looked at of the braiding tables were men sitting there doing the braiding, but then like the actual, like the wire work and being in the home was almost exclusively women. So it's just really interesting to think how it became monetized and then it came back to being more of a private craft. It was kind of interesting. Hair, right? It's a hairy situation all around. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Thank you for watching another episode in our Lessons in History series. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we'd love for you to reach out to us through our website. And just thank you for being here and listening today.
In the meantime, stay tuned for more history videos.